unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Romeo and Juliet. Almost everyone knows the story of Romeo and Juliet. It is one of the world's most famous love stories. It is frequently staged and has been made into films and adapted for the musical West Side Story. Even in Shakespeare's time, the story was well known. He took the plot and turned it into a play full of brilliant love poetry, which was highly popular at the time. His romantic tragedy is also about hatred and its power to destroy lives. The play is set in Verona, in Italy, where a long-standing feud exists between two powerful families, the Montagues and the Capulets. The families are like modern mafia families. They run things and settle scores with old enemies using violence, which leads to more violence. The hot-headed young men of the Montagues and Capulets are quickly roused to mindless thuggery. The play opens with a street brawl that turns into a violent battle that alarms the citizens. The ruling prince stops the battle and promises death to those who continue it. Romeo, a Montague, is lovesick for a Capulet girl. To catch a glimpse of her, he goes masked to a glittering party at the house of the Capulets. But once there, he meets Juliet, a girl of even greater beauty, who is not yet 14. Passion flares between them, and they arrange to meet secretly later that night. In the moonlight, the two pour out their love in a stream of matchless verse. They know that they love where their families hate, but their feelings are so strong that they would die for love, as in the end they do. The two tell their secret, Romeo to his best friend Mercutio, and Juliet to her nurse. Neither understands the depth of the lovers' feelings. Next day, Friar Lawrence, Romeo's priest, agrees to marry the couple secretly. Once the two are united, surely their families will forget their old quarrels. After the ceremony, Romeo and Juliet arrange to see each other that night, but then Romeo is caught up in the feud. Hot-headed Tybalt of the Capulet clan kills Romeo's friend, Mercutio. Romeo is stricken with grief and avenges his friend's death by killing Tybalt in a duel. His punishment is exile. Romeo risks his life to spend one night with Juliet and then rushes away at dawn. Not knowing that she is already married, Juliet's family arrange for her to marry her suitor, Paris. To sort out the situation, Friar Lawrence suggests a complicated scheme involving Juliet's faked death, but like many such plans, everything goes terribly wrong and both lovers die. As the star-crossed lovers lie united in death, the two families agree to be reconciled and make their peace. Shakespeare's play was first performed in 1595 at the theatre in Shoreditch in London and was one of his earliest plays. Its success helped him to buy a large house in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. The power of the play's impact on its audience is all the more remarkable when we remember that in Shakespeare's day there were no women actors. Boys played all the female parts, including that of Juliet. What captured the audience was the magic and music of Shakespeare's words that are still relevant today. Theatre directors often update the setting of Romeo and Juliet, so that the lovers come, for instance, from Protestant or Catholic families in Northern Ireland, or, as in West Side Story, from different ethnic communities in New York. It is a play that reminds us that both hatred and love are blind, and that the innocent are often hurt by the intolerance of people who should know better.
Romeo and Juliet. In old Verona, where the streets were hot and narrow and the walls were high, Where men were as bright as wasps and carried quick swords for their stings, there lived two families, the Capulets and the Montagues, who hated each other worse than death. They had but to pass in the street, and they were at each other's throats like dogs in the sun. Cursing and shouting and bawling, and crashing from civil pillar to post, they filled the good people of Verona with fear and anger to have their city's peace so senselessly disturbed. They were at it again. In the buzzing heat of a July morning, two lazy, no-good servants of the Capulets had spied two strolling men of the Montagues. Looks had been exchanged, then words, and in moments the peaceful market was in an uproar as the four idle ruffians set about defending their master's honour by smashing up stalls, overturning baskets, wrecking shops and wounding passers-by in their valiant endeavours to cut each other into pieces. Benvolio, a sensible young Montague, came upon the scene and tried to put a stop to it. Tybalt, a young Capulet so full of fury that he sweated knives, promptly went for Benvolio. Old Montague and old Capulet appeared and tried to draw their doddering swords, that surely would have shaken more like straws in the wind than lightning in the sky. Men shouted, women screamed, and rushed to drag wandering infants into safety, and bloody riot threatened to swallow up all the fair city till the Prince of Verona, with soldiers, came furiously into the square. "Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace," he roared, and by dint of stern anger and sterner threats, restored some semblance of peace. The vile, destructive brawling between the Montagues and the Capulets incensed him beyond measure. "If you ever disturb our streets again," he swore, "your lives shall pay the forfeit." When the prince had gone, taking old Capulet with him, to remove one half of the quarrel and so leave the other without an object, Lady Montague spoke to Benvolio. "Oh, where is Romeo? Saw you him today?" she asked. "Right glad I am he was not at this fray," she added, as if Romeo, her only son, was as hot-headed as any, and would surely have come to grief among the flashing swords and blundering fists. But Romeo had been elsewhere, wrapped in a melancholy that was most mysterious to his parents. "See where he comes!" exclaimed Benvolio, as the young man in question drifted dolefully into the square, as if he was a ghost under instruction to haunt it. "So please you, step aside," he urged old Montague and his wife. "I'll know his grievance." The parents departed, leaving Benvolio to penetrate the inscrutable mystery of his cousin Romeo's gloom. It proved no great task, as Romeo was all too willing to talk. He was in love, hopelessly. He doted to distraction upon a glorious creature by the name of Rosaline, and she would have nothing to do with him. So far as she was concerned, he was dust. Consequently, he had been mooning all morning, lovesick, in a grove of sycamores. Patiently, Benvolio listened to the extensive catalogue of Rosaline's amazing charms. He shook his head and ventured to suggest that if only Romeo looked about him, he might find others as fair. Impossible. The world was not so rich as to hold another such as Rosaline. Benvolio expressed doubts, but Romeo was adamant. And so they continued, strolling through the golden warm streets of Verona, Romeo all melancholy passion, and Benvolio all cheerful good sense. "Why, Romeo, art thou mad?" began Benvolio, when a serving-man, much bewildered and with a paper in his hand, accosted them. "I pray, sir, can you read?" It seemed the fellow's master had entrusted him with a list of guests to be invited to a banquet that night, but being no scholar, he could make neither head nor tail of the writing. Obligingly, Romeo read out the names. They were a distinguished company, and among them was Rosaline. Where was the feast to be? Alas, at the house of old Capulet, a dangerous place for a Montague. But if he went masked and in fantastical costume, as was the custom for uninvited guests at such a feast— "Go thither," urged Benvolio, anxious to cure his cousin of that sickness called Rosaline. He had noticed that on the list had been the best beauties of Verona, beside whom Rosaline might well not shine so bright. "Compare her face," he advised shrewdly, "with some that I shall show, and I will make thee think thy swan a crow." They met that night in the street outside the Capulet's house, Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio, who was a kinsman of the prince and Romeo's dearest friend. He was a lively, mocking youth, as full of bubbling laughter as a glass of good wine. They met by torchlight with some half-dozen others, all in fantastical costume and gilded masks, as if King Midas had patted their heads and made fortunes of their faces. Like gorgeous dragonflies with partly folded wings, they leaned against the high wall that enclosed the Capulet's orchard, laughing and talking and trying, by all manner and means, to lift up Romeo's depressed spirits. But he, dressed as a rather splendid pilgrim, in deference to the notion that any place that held Rosaline must be a holy shrine, remained as dull as lead. Neither Benvolio's urging nor Mercutio's wit affected him. He stayed glum, and furthermore had a strange premonition that the night's festivities would turn out to have been the beginning of a journey to the grave. At length the maskers gave up their efforts, and with their gloomy companion went into the feasting-house. At once they were dazzled by a blaze of candles and a blaze of beauty, of silks and satins, soft white skin and dark, delighted eyes. "You are welcome, gentlemen," cried old Capulet, in holiday robes, and cheerful to see so fine a company of maskers at his feast. "Come, musicians, play. A hall, give room, and foot it, girls." Music scraped and set a pulse, and the dancing began. Gowns rustled, filling the air with perfume. Buckled shoes, like bright mice, twinkled in and out of richly swinging hems. Fingers touched, hands entwined. Masks and faces bobbed and turned, exchanging silver looks for golden smiles. All were dancing but Romeo. He stood, marble pilgrim, stock still and amazed. At last he spoke to a servant standing by. "What lady's that which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight?" "I know not, sir," returned the servant. "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright," breathed Romeo, as he gazed at the girl whose beauty had, in an instant, overturned his heart. But though he had spoken softly, it had been too loud. This, by his voice, should be a Montague. Tybalt had recognized the masker. He was enraged that one of that hated name should dare to mock the Capulet's feast with his presence. He sent a page for his rapier. His uncle, old Capulet, sharply bade him keep his temper. It was a night of feast and revelry, and not to be spoiled. He commanded Tybalt to leave Romeo in peace. "I'll not endure him," cried Tybalt furiously. "He shall be endured," ordered old Capulet with mounting indignation. "I say he shall. Go to, am I the master here or you? Go to." Unable to contain his anger, Tybalt departed. There was vengeance in his heart. He vowed that he would call Romeo to account for the supposed insult to the Capulets. Romeo, unaware of the sudden hatred directed against him, moved among the dancers towards his sudden love. At last he stood before her, and his eyes, inside his golden eyes, shone with rapture. Her loveliness had increased 100-fold with nearness. Startled, she looked at the pilgrim, and such was the warmth of his passion that she took fire herself. Their hands touched. They spoke, half humorously, half solemnly. He begged a kiss. She was too young to hide her heart, and too innocent to pretend an innocence. She granted the request. Then, like children for the first time having tasted strawberries, they wanted more. They kissed again. "Madam, your mother craves a word with you." The world outside broke in upon them, in the shape of a female with a billowing bosom and skirts that might have covered half a county. Reluctantly the girl parted from her passionate pilgrim, and went in answer to the summons. "What is her mother?" asked Romeo, following her every movement till she was lost among the throng. "Her mother is the lady of the house," answered the female complacently. "I nursed her daughter that you talked withal." "I tell you," she confided, with a wink and a nudge and a knowing smile that creased up her face like a marriage bed, "he that can lay hold of her shall have the chinks." She bustled away after her charge, leaving Romeo dismayed. He, the son of Montague, had fallen in love with the daughter of Capulet. Despairingly he cursed the night in which he had been so blessed, the night when Romeo first set eyes on Juliet. The maskers left the house and met outside by the orchard wall, meaning to make a night of it in Verona's hot, dark streets. Romeo was not among them. They called him, searched for him, tried to conjure him up in the name of his fair Rosaline and all her delicious parts. In vain. He did not appear, so they went away, laughing loudly at the foolish melancholy of love. Romeo heard them go. "He jests at scars," he murmured, ruefully reflecting that to him love was falling among roses and being savaged by their thorns, that never felt a wound. He had climbed the high wall and was hiding in shadows within the Capulet's orchard. His situation was dangerous, but love lent a brightness to it, just as danger lent an edge to his love. He gazed up towards the dark side of the house. A light appeared in a window, before which there was a balcony, like a carved stone pocket some dozen feet from the ground. The window opened, and out onto the balcony stepped Juliet. She looked out onto the night and sighed. "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" she inquired most earnestly, and then, with gentle longing, urged, "Deny thy father, and refuse thy name." She, like Romeo, had discovered that her greatest love was her father's greatest hate. She frowned and shook her head. "'Tis but thy name that is my enemy," she argued with ingenious philosophy. "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called." So she continued, putting her case before an audience of moon and stars, until Romeo came from among the shadows and stood beneath the balcony. At once she was alarmed. Then, when she saw who it was fearful for his safety in her father's garden, then ashamed when she realized that he must have overheard her private confession of love. Eagerly, Romeo dismissed the danger, and rejoiced in the confession which, by its frankness, had shortcut all tedious custom of roundabout approach, and in the twinkling of an eye had plunged them both fathoms deep into each other's hearts, as though they had lived there all their lives. Even so, she begged him to leave, as she feared more and more for his safety. "Oh, wilt thou leave me so unsatisfied?" pleaded Romeo. "What satisfaction canst thou have tonight?" she answered gently. "The exchange of thy love's faithful vow for mine," he cried. A voice called from within the room. It was Juliet's nurse. Hurriedly, Juliet begged Romeo to wait and went inside. A moment later she was back on the balcony. "3 words, dear Romeo," she whispered down, and then, scorning arithmetic, went on with many, many more. If Romeo was honourable, and his purpose marriage, she would send to him tomorrow, so that he might tell her the time and place where the ceremony might be performed. Again the nurse called, and again Juliet seemed plucked inside as by an apron string, and again came back at once. More arrangements were made for the following day, and more love exchanged, until, at last, there was no avoiding the parting. Good night, sighed Juliet. "Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow." She went back into her room. Romeo waited a little longer, and then climbed back over the orchard wall. Rosaline and all her charms had been swept from his mind and heart, and Juliet, too, had quite forgotten that she had been betrothed that very morning to a rich young man of her father's choice. As soon as it was light, Romeo sought out his confessor, Friar Lawrence, in a monastery some little way out of the town, and begged the worthy priest to marry him to Juliet that very day. At first, the good friar was too taken aback by the sudden setting of Rosaline to comprehend the glorious sunrise of Juliet, but then, seeing the strength of Romeo's love, and knowing the honesty of his heart, and thinking that by such a union the hatred between the Montagues and the Capulets might be buried forever, he agreed to perform the ceremony. It was to take place in the Holy Friar's cell on that afternoon. In high delight, Romeo returned to the Sunshine Town to await Juliet's messenger. While Romeo had been away from his house on his mission of love, Tybalt had called on a mission of hate. Not finding Romeo, he had left a letter challenging the son of Montague to a duel to the death. This challenge had been found by Benvolio and Mercutio, who were still seeking their companion who had given them the slip on the previous night. "Romeo will answer it," said Benvolio. "Any man that can write may answer a letter," chuckled Mercutio, and the pair went their way through the bright streets, making fun of Tybalt and his fury. Presently they met Romeo, but before they could tell him of the challenge, Juliet's nurse, with skirts rolling and bosom billowing, came majestically down the street. At once the 3 friends, overcome by the female's size and dignity, set about her like mad butterflies mocking an old cabbage. They twisted her, turned her, upended her words and her wits till she shook with indignation in all her bulging parts. At last she managed to say that it was Romeo she looked for, and Romeo alone. So Mercutio and Benvolio went away, laughing their heads off, and clean forgot about Tybalt and his murderous letter. As soon as they were alone, The nurse begged Romeo to deal honestly with Juliet, who was very young. Romeo swore he would. "Bid her devise," he pleaded with the nurse, "some means to come to Shrift this afternoon, and there she shall at Friar Lawrence's cell be shrived and married." Gleefully the nurse received the news. Although she knew that Juliet was already betrothed to another, the prospect of a marriage and a wedding night acted upon her like strong wine. After all, so long as there was a husband, it mattered little whether it was one man or another. Full of thoughts of the bounding joys of the marriage bed, she rushed away to tell her young mistress and to prepare her. That very afternoon, in Friar Lawrence's cell, Juliet and Romeo were married. Juliet became a Montague, and Romeo in the same instant became kin to all the Capulets. From the harsh soil of the two families' enmity had sprung a single flower of love. The day was hot, and men's blood boiled in their veins. Tybalt, seeking a violent answer to his violent letter, came upon Romeo's two friends. "Mercutio," he cried, with contempt in his voice and manner, "thou consortest with Romeo." "Consort?" answered Mercutio angrily. "What, dost thou make us minstrels?" Anxiously, Benvolio tried to keep the peace that was so suddenly threatened. Romeo appeared. Tybalt turned aside from Mercutio. "Well, peace be with you, sir," he said. "Here comes my man." Coldly, he insulted Romeo. Passers-by began to gather, but at a respectable distance, for surely there was going to be a fight. Tybalt challenged Romeo to draw his sword. Romeo refused. He had, within that hour, been married to Juliet, and so was united with the house of Capulet. He would not, he could not, shed any of their blood. But as the marriage was still secret, he was forced to hold his tongue. "Oh, calm, dishonourable, vile submission," cried Mercutio, unable to understand Romeo's reluctance to fight. "Tybalt, you rat-catcher, will you walk?" He drew his sword, and in a moment he and mad Tybalt were thrusting and parrying and darting at each other with their shining, deadly stings. "Draw, Benvolio!" cried Romeo, aghast. "Beat down their weapons. Gentlemen, for shame, forbear this outrage. Tybalt, Mercutio!" He seized his friend, meaning to hold him back. Murderous Tybalt lunged, and his sword, like a thin snake, struck under Romeo's arm and pierced Mercutio's breast. Then he fled. "I am hurt," muttered Mercutio, finding himself to be a sudden victim of the hatred between Capulet and Montague. "A plague on both your houses." "What, art thou hurt?" asked Benvolio, supporting Mercutio, who was sinking to the ground. Aye, a scratch, a scratch." "Courage, man," urged Romeo. "The hurt cannot be much." "No, 'tis not so deep as a well," agreed Mercutio, "nor so wide as the church door. But 'tis enough, 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. I am peppered, I warrant, for this world. A plague on both your houses." He was carried into the nearest house, and soon after the news came out that Mercutio, brave, witty, laughing Mercutio, was dead. Even as Romeo stood, amazed and overcome with grief, and blaming himself for his friend's death, Tybalt returned. This time Romeo did not refuse the challenge. He drew his sword, and mad for revenge, beat down Tybalt's furious blade, which was still red with Mercutio's blood, and killed him before he knew what he had done. "Romeo!" cried Benvolio, terrified by the sudden disaster. "Away, begone! The prince will doom thee death if thou art taken. Hence! Begone, away!" Only then did Romeo understand. On the very day he had married, he had killed his new wife's kinsman and so condemned himself to death. "Oh, I am Fortune's fool," he wept, and rushed away, leaving Tybalt spidered on the ground and slowly reddening Verona's street. He fled for sanctuary to Friar Lawrence's cell, and there, shaking and trembling, he learned that the prince had been merciful. As the quarrel had been forced upon Romeo, the prince had sentenced him to banishment instead of to death. He was to leave Verona and never set foot inside its walls again. Such was the prince's mercy, but to Romeo it was worse than death. Not to see Juliet again was to condemn him to a living grave. The good friar tried to reason with him, to teach him to make the best of the life that had been granted. "Thou canst not speak of that thou dost not feel," cried Romeo in despair. "Wert thou as young as I, Juliet thy love, an hour but married, Tybalt murdered, doting like me, and like me banished, then mightst thou speak." To this there was no answer, for who could know what Romeo felt but Romeo, and who could know that Juliet was his world? Had he been older, he might have been wiser, if indeed it's wisdom to be calculating in affection and circumspect in love. There was a knock upon the door. It was the nurse, come in haste from her mistress, who was in despair over the death of her dear cousin and the banishment of her husband. Romeo's remorse knew no bounds. He threatened to kill himself, but the holy friar stayed his hand. "Go," he advised the wildly grieving youth. "Get thee to thy love as was decreed. Ascend her chamber, hence, and comfort her." Hope revived as Romeo listened to the friar's words. He would spend that night, his wedding night, in Juliet's arms, and early on the following day he would go to Mantua, where he would wait until his marriage might be made known and the prince's pardon obtained. The friar would send to him. The orchard was dark, but the stars were pale. Presently a bird began to sing. The new husband and the new wife, sleepy from love, came out onto the balcony, which held them like another bed, a bed of stone. "It is not yet near day," lied Juliet. "It was the nightingale and not the lark." Romeo shook his head. "It was the lark, the herald of the morn. Look, love, night's candles are burnt out." "Yond light is not daylight," denied Juliet. "I know it." But it was to no avail. The night was over and the time for parting come. "Farewell, farewell, one kiss and I'll descend," murmured Romeo. They embraced, and he slipped unwillingly from Juliet's despairing arms and climbed down to the dark ground. He looked up, and she, overhanging the balcony, with her willow hair weeping, stared down. And each in that last moment was chilled with a sudden foreboding and seemed to see the other pale and dead. Then Romeo was gone. The Capulet's house was in sad confusion. Tybalt had been laid to rest, and Juliet, supposedly grieving for her murdered cousin, was a ghost of sobs and tears. Old Capulet, ever impatient with the sorrows of the young, which to him were as trifling as the peevish mewing of a baby, to be quietened by a sweet or a new toy, spoke with his wife and the County Paris, the excellent and well-connected youth to whom he had betrothed his daughter. "What day is this?" he demanded. "Monday, my lord," said Paris. "Monday? Ha-ha! Well, Wednesday is too soon." "A Thursday, let it be. A Thursday, tell her," he instructed his wife. "She shall be married to this noble earl." He nodded with high satisfaction. A husband was the very thing to quieten his wailing child. "We'll have some 6 friends," he decided, "and they're an end. But what say you to Thursday?" The youth was in agreement, and old Capulet was satisfied that the joyful tidings of such an occasion would put a stop to his daughter's grief. The joyful tidings were received, but far from joyfully. Juliet was filled with dread and horror. Too frightened to confess that she was already married, and to a Montague, she sought frantically to avoid, to delay this impossible second marriage. "Here comes your father," said Lady Capulet, shocked by her daughter's reluctance to obey her parents' command. "Tell him so yourself, and see how he will take it at your hands." The father was no better pleased. Turning in fury on his disobedient child, he shouted, but fettle your fine joints against Thursday next to go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither. Out, you green sickness carrion, out, you baggage, you tallow face. Good father, pleaded Juliet, weeping and on her knees. Hang thee, young baggage, raged her father. Get thee to church a Thursday, or never after look me in the face. Then, when the father and mother had gone, the nurse took up their cause, but more gently. I think it best you married with the county, she urged, for a second marriage meant no more to her than another joyful, bounding wedding night. Oh, he's a lovely gentleman, she sighed. Romeo's a dish-clout to him. Well, thou hast comforted me marvellous much, said Juliet, her last prop gone, and with nothing left in all the world to cling to but Romeo's love. Go in and tell my lady I am gone, having displeased my father, to Lawrence's cell, to make confession and to be absolved. To the monastery she went, and there, in the holy friar's cell, poured out all her misery and despair. The old man listened, and moved by Juliet's all-consuming love for Romeo, and also concerned for the sin he would be bringing upon himself by performing a second marriage, devised a strange, fantastic plan. If this plan succeeded, then great happiness would be the result. If it failed, then Verona, Juliet and Romeo, Capulet and Montague would stand forever in the world's memory for love's tragedy. This was the friar's plan. He knew of a liquor that, if drunk, would produce so exact a counterfeit of death that none could tell the difference. This state would continue for 42 hours, after which there would be a harmless awakening. On the Wednesday night, when she was alone, Juliet was to drink this liquor, so that, when her people came to wake her in the morning for her wedding, they would find her seeming dead. Then, as was the custom, she would be laid in her best attire in the family monument. There, after a proper time, she would awaken, and Romeo would be beside her. Letters would have been sent to Mantua telling him of the plan, so that he and Juliet might escape together to safety and happiness. I'll send a friar with speed, promised the old priest. Love, give me strength, prayed Juliet, taking the vial of liquor from Friar Lawrence. Farewell, dear father. In darkly winding Mantua, news came to Romeo from Verona, but not from Friar Lawrence. It was news brought by Romeo's servant, and it was as black as hell. Juliet was dead. Leave me, muttered Romeo, sick with amazement and grief. Hast thou no letters to me from the friar? There was none. For what more could be told than that Romeo's world was lost and his life was a vain pretence? He went to buy strong poison from an apothecary, and set off for Verona and Juliet's tomb. Well, Juliet, he whispered, I will lie with thee tonight. The letter telling Romeo the truth of what had happened had never left Verona. The wretched brother who had been entrusted with it had been shut up in a house suspected of the plague, and it was night before he was freed. He went at once to Friar Lawrence and told him of the misadventure. The friar was filled with deep concern. Juliet would soon awaken, and she would be alone in a dead man's tomb. He himself must go to the monument and be on hand for the awakening. The churchyard was dark, and the yew trees stood black among the pale monuments, as if the day's mourners had left their shadows behind. Paris, the unlucky bridegroom who, on his wedding morning, had come to claim his bride and found her dead, now came with tears and flowers to her midnight tomb. He sent his page a little way off to warn him of any intruder, for he wanted to mourn and weep in solitude. Presently, the page whistled. Someone was approaching. Paris hid from sight. The intruder appeared. It was that Montague who had been banished for murdering poor Juliet's cousin. What further act of violence was he about to commit? Dear God, he was opening sweet Juliet's tomb. Stop thy unhallowed toil, vile Montague, he cried. Can vengeance be pursued further than death? Romeo turned. His face was pale, as if death had already touched it. He begged Paris leave him and be gone. Enraged, Paris tried to seize him for a felon. Wilt thou provoke me? Shouted Romeo. "Then have at thee, boy!" They drew their swords, and there, among the solemn dead, they fought like madmen until one, young Paris, fell dying to the ground. "If thou be merciful," he begged his unwilling murderer, "open the tomb. Lay me with Juliet." "In faith, I will," promised Romeo, but to a man already dead. He dragged him into the monument and laid him down within the low, vaulted chamber where, among stored-up Capulets long since ransacked by worms, lay Juliet upon a bed of stone. Death had not yet begun to spoil her. She might be living still. He knelt beside her and made his sad farewell. "Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace. And lips, oh, you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death." Then, with a sudden joyfulness, he cried, "Here's to my love," and drank the apothecary's poison, and so, in an instant, ended for ever the parting from his love. When Friar Lawrence, old, hobbling, infirm and fearful, at last entered the tomb, Romeo was dead, and Juliet just awakening. "Oh, comfortable friar, where is my lord?" she asked gently. "Where is my Romeo?" Wretchedly he told her, and wretchedly begged her to come away. "Go, get thee hence," she answered, with a dignity that would have humbled a king, "for I will not away." The old priest, who had meant so well and done so ill, crept away from the consequence of his endeavours, and left Juliet alone with her dead. Longingly, she kissed Romeo's lips in the hope that some poison still remained on them. There was none, so she took his dagger and pressed it lovingly into her heart. So, in old Verona, died Juliet and Romeo, who loved at last sight no less than at their first. The fathers, old Capulet and Montague, were grief-stricken by the tragic deaths of their children, and ashamed that their old hate had brought it about. They vowed eternal friendship to one another, and now the Capulets and Montagues and old Verona live only in the great love of Juliet and Romeo.
Shakespeare Today by Dr. Rex Gibson. Shakespeare is alive today. Although William Shakespeare the man lies long buried in Stratford-upon-Avon parish church, he lives on in countless millions of hearts and minds. Imagine that cold April day in 1616. The small funeral procession labours slowly along Church Street. Huge black horses draw the wooden cart bearing the simple coffin. On the coffin, a few daffodils and primroses, plucked only minutes before from the garden of New Place, gravely nod with each jolt and jar of the rutted road. Most of Stratford's citizens have turned out, muffled against the biting wind, to see the last appearance of their wealthy neighbour. You couldn't call it a crowd, just small, respectful groups clustering the dry places on the roadside, careful to avoid the mud splashed up by the great hooves of the lumbering horses. Men and women briefly bow their heads as the dead man and the black-clad mourners pass. The townspeople share their opinions, as neighbours do. "He used to do some acting, didn't he?" Made a lot of money in London. Writing plays, I think. Used to come home once a year to see his family, but nobody here really knew a lot about Master Shakespeare. Wasn't he a poet? Big landowner hereabouts, anyway. All those fields over at Wilcombe. Past the Guild Chapel, where he had worshipped as a boy, past the school where long ago his imagination was fired by language. At the churchyard gate, under the sad elms, 6 men effortlessly heave the coffin onto their shoulders. William Shakespeare is about to enter his parish church for the last time. Nobody at that long-ago funeral guessed that they were saying goodbye to a man who would become the most famous Englishman of his age, perhaps of all time. Shakespeare lives on. He weaves familiar themes into his tales, the conflicts between parents and children, love at first sight, the power struggles of war and politics. His language is heard everywhere. If you ever call someone a blinking idiot, or a tower of strength, or describe them as tongue-tied, or suffering from green-eyed jealousy, or being dead as a doornail, you are speaking the language of Shakespeare. If you say, "Oh, it was Greek to me," or "parting is such sweet sorrow," or that something is too much of a good thing, and that you have not slept one wink, the words of Shakespeare are alive in your mouth. Shakespeare's language has a power all of its own, rich in emotional intensity. Because he was a poet who wrote plays, he could make even the simplest words utterly memorable. All around the world people know Hamlet's line, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Shakespeare is still performed today because of the electrifying power of his storytelling. Whether his story is about love or murder or kings and queens, he keeps you on the edge of your seat wanting to know what happens next. He created well over 900 characters in his plays. However large or small the part, each character springs vividly to life in performance. They live in our imagination because they are so much like people today. They experience the same emotions that everyone feels and recognizes: love, jealousy, fear, courage, ambition, pride, and 100 others. In every play, Shakespeare invites us to imagine what the characters are like. And for nearly 400 years, people have accepted Shakespeare's invitation. The plays have been reimagined in very many ways. They have been shortened, added to, and set in very different periods of history. They have been translated into many languages and performed all over the world. Shakespeare lives because all persons in every age and every society can make their own interpretations and performances of Shakespeare. You too can make your own living Shakespeare. Try reading the play either by yourself, changing your voice to suit the different characters, or with friends, and record it on a tape recorder. If you have a toy theatre, try staging it with characters and scenery that you make and paint yourself. Or collect together a cast and create your own production for your family and friends.